to look at an argument for utilitarianism, or actually we'll take a look at two of them. We'll look at what Mill officially says, and then we'll look at a revision of it that I think is actually a bit clearer and more straightforward. So what does Mill officially say? Well, first he says that each person desires their own happiness as an end in itself. So each person desires happiness not because they desire anything else, but because they desire their own happiness. Secondly, he says that each person doesn't desire anything else as an end in itself. The only thing that they desire for itself, in and of itself, is their very own happiness. And he tells us that, well, what a person, effectively he tells us, he doesn't say it in quite this language, but what a person desires as an end in itself and what is intrinsically good for them, those are the same thing. So people's desires are, in this sense, fundamentally accurate about what is good for them. So these three claims together tell us that what is good for a person is their happiness and nothing else. Mill then says, okay, well, what's good for a community? Just what's the sum of what's good for each of its individual members. So it's good for each of its individual members, their happiness, and so it's good for the community as a whole, the overall happiness. Okay? So that tells us the good for a community is a sum of its members' happiness. And Mill says, okay, well, what should you do? You should do what will ever is best for the community, and therefore, what's best for the community? Its members' happiness. So you should promote overall happiness. So there it is. That's the argument. And, if we wanted to put suffering in here too, then we would just do the same thing, but for suffering being bad. So, okay. Well, so here are these four claims. Each person desires nothing other than their own happiness as an end in itself. What a person desires as an end in itself is what is intrinsically good for them. The good for a community is the sum of the good for the community's members, and you should promote whatever is good for the community. Each of these claims is questionable. Arguably, people desire things other than happiness as ends in themselves. It's not obvious that people's desires are what they desire, even as ends in themselves is good for them. It's questionable what the good for a whole community is, if there even is such a thing. And finally, what should you promote? Should you care about the good for the community? That's not so obvious. So these are all, I don't say I've argued against them, but they're all questionable. They're all debatable. We're not going to debate all of them right now. I want to talk about the last one, you should promote whatever is good for the community, because I think in thinking about that premise, we'll get closer in a way to, I think, where Mill is really coming from. So who is the community anyway? Is it the people, say, at El Camino, or at whatever school you're at? Is it the people in your town or city, in Torrance or Hawthorne or Gardena or wherever you are? Maybe it's all humans. Maybe it includes non-human animals. Maybe it's all sentient beings. Who knows, right? And how would you decide? Well, the answer in a way is the moral community. And what do we mean by the moral community? We mean those who count morally. Those who are of moral significance in any way. Those who we should care about. Which is a nice thing to say, but that doesn't answer our question, because we want to know, who are they? So, okay, those people who count morally, we take their happiness into account and their suffering into account. It makes a difference to what we should do. Okay, good. But who? Whose happiness and whose suffering counts morally? Well, Mill thinks that all happiness is good and all suffering is bad, right? The happiness is intrinsically good, whoever has it, and suffering is intrinsically bad, whoever has it, or whatever has it. And how can I realize this? Well, I can start from my case and reason out to others, in the case of others. So I learn about the goodness of happiness by experiencing it. I learn about the badness of suffering by experiencing it for myself. I experience my own happiness and think, oh, that's good. I experience my own suffering and think, oh, that's bad. But what's good about my happiness is not that it's mine, it's that it's happiness, or at least that's what Mill would say. And in particular, that means it would be good whoever had it. So there's nothing special about my happiness that's good. It's happiness, the happiness that I learn about most directly is my own happiness. But I don't learn about its mindness being good. I learn about the fact that it's happiness. That's what makes it good. So Mill would think that starting from my happiness, I recognize that my happiness is good I can get to the conclusion that every being's happiness is good because there's nothing special about my happiness that makes it good, right? I learn that my happiness is good, but I can see it's not the mindness that's good, so I can say, oh, happiness in general is good. And we also are come with built-in detectors that tell us that other people's happiness is good and their suffering is bad. We can recognize more directly the value of others' happiness than by reasoning out to it in the way I just described. That's what happens with sympathy and empathy, with generosity, and with compassion. So Mill thinks that this fellow feeling, the sociability that we have that's built into us as humans, that's recognizing values that are out there. That's how it works, right? Just like we have color vision and shape vision, so we have emotions that are responding to things that are out there in the world, and in particular that are responding to the value of other people's happiness and suffering. So on this view then, the moral community is going to be all sentient beings. Any being that can suffer or be happy, they count because their suffering and their happiness counts. What's morally fundamental is the happiness and the suffering. That's what we care. That's what's of value, and that's what our actions should promote or minimize. It's not, in the end, the beings who can be happy and suffer that matters. It's the happiness and the suffering. And so each sentient being's happiness and suffering contributes to the total that is good or bad, and that makes our actions right or wrong. And so the welfare of each sentient being is going to be equally important. More happiness counts for more suffering counts for more, whoever has it. So lizards, goldfishes, and maybe even bees, who knows? Bees have minds. Maybe they can even feel pain and pleasure. So their happiness, it's not going to count for as much as ours. Let's just say a lizard, but why not? Because it's very little happiness, presumably. So we imagine, how much happiness can a lizard have? Not very much, probably. How much happiness can a goldfish have? Not very much, probably. Can a bee have any happiness? Well, maybe bees can feel pain and pleasure in a very minimal way. But lizards and goldfishes and bees count less, but the reason they count less is just because they don't have very much in the way of happiness or suffering. It's not because there's something sort of lesser or greater about a lizard or goldfish intrinsically. It's just because how much suffering, how much happiness do they have? Not very much in any direction. But they're equally important, at least insofar as the degree of happiness that a goldfish can have is, that same degree of happiness for you, it's worth exactly the same thing. You're worth more, you're more important because you can experience more happiness than a goldfish can have, but if we just compare if we take the same degree of happiness, it doesn't matter whether or not it's you or the goldfish that has that happiness. And in this way, Mill's view is very, very impartial. Happiness and suffering are important, whatever has them, whoever has them. Each being's well-being contributes to the total, and in calculating the total well-being, you look at each being and add their well-being. You don't care whose it was. Your well-being, my well-being, it's no more or less important for being mine or yours. The whose it is doesn't matter. It matters what it is. How much well-being are we talking about, not who has the well-being. So his revised argument, then, I think we can put like this. Only happiness is good, whoever has it. Only suffering is bad, whoever has it. You should do whatever maximizes the balance of the good over the bad, and so you should maximize the balance of total happiness over total suffering. And this, we don't sort of explicitly talk about the community here, the moral community, but it's built into premise one that only happiness is good, whoever has it. So the moral community is whoever can have happiness and whoever can have suffering. And we might wonder about this argument. Is all happiness intrinsically good all the time? Maybe if you're happy about doing something evil, you shouldn't be happy. Is anything besides happiness good? Maybe virtue or something like that? And coming from a different angle, why do all goods matter to what I should do? Why is it that what's morally appropriate for me to do is hooked up with everybody's good? Even if all happiness is good, why does it make a difference to what I should do? And this is basically the egoist objection, and there's sort of different ways to put it. One way you could be an egoist is you could say, only my happiness is good. Actually, nobody else's happiness matters. In fact, the only thing that's good is my happiness. That's not a view that you could hold, or it would be very strange for you to hold that, because if you agreed with that, then you'd be saying, oh, only Professor Struvel's happiness is good. My own happiness doesn't matter. And that would be a weird thing to say, and I don't think you would want to say that. A different way to put the egoist objection would be to say the only thing good for each person is their own happiness, and there's no further sense in which there's any sort of bigger, broader good. Or you could say, well, maybe there is, but the only thing each person should promote are goods involving themselves and not goods involving anything else. They don't have any obligation to anything else, any other goods. So I'm going to briefly consider how Mill would reply to that egoist objection, and then that will be the end of this video. So the first point is to say, well, look, I do take some other people's happiness seriously, and I do value it, right? And you value other people's happiness. In particular, you're going to value the happiness of your friends and probably of your family to at least some extent, depending upon what your family's like, maybe not. But presumably there are some people, personal acquaintances, whose happiness you value, who it's important to you that they be happy, and you care about it, and you don't want them to suffer. You value it. That means I value things besides my own happiness. I recognize that things besides my own happiness are good. And that means I already think the egoist is wrong. Now, if you don't recognize the importance of anybody else's happiness and anybody else's suffering, then I'm not, I think at that point, Mill would think you're a sociopath, and you can't be reasoned with, but that doesn't mean you're right. It means you're missing something, just like that means you're deeply value blind, just like someone might be colorblind. But once you, assuming you're not that value blind, you recognize the value of some other people's happiness, that already makes the egoist wrong. And then the utilitarian takes the next step and says, there's nothing special about my happiness, or my friend's happiness, or my family's happiness. And that's the utilitarian being impartial, right? So that's the impartiality. That's the no particular being's happiness is any more important or any less important just because it's that being that has the happiness. Okay, if we agree with that, then we would conclude that every being's happiness is valuable, and we're at the utilitarian conclusion. So we can really think of there being as sort of there are two steps. There's a step from myself out at all, and then there's the, okay, well, why should I draw boundaries between anybody? Once I move beyond myself and say I'm not the only thing that's valuable, okay, other things are valuable, well, the utilitarian thinks there's no way to say one or the other is more valuable, it's all valuable, and then you get the utilitarian conclusion. Okay, so that's our discussion of the utilitarian argument, except that we'll be coming back to this argument and evaluating some other objections to it from some other ethical theories besides egoism in the next unit. In the final video in this unit, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of utilitarianism. So let's turn to that.